up on that walkout song connection to the state treasurer. We work hard for the money. Right, Mike? All right, good afternoon and welcome to the meeting of Rotary Club of Seattle number 4, named for being the 4th oldest and one of the largest. I'm Beth Knox, your club president, and I want to recognize that we are convening this meeting on the traditional land of the Coast Salish peoples. Now, land acknowledgements are important, but it's also vital that we educate ourselves about our Indigenous ancestors. Rotary members are invited to join club member Kathy Williams this Saturday at the Duwamish Longhouse to learn about the people and cultures. You can find details at seattlerotary.org. Now, our club enjoys music, singing, and inspiration to kick off our meetings. Leading our music today is Raymond Tymus Jones and accompanied by Freeman Fong. Following the music, I invite Skip Cotkins to share our inspiration for the day. Raymond? Oh, excuse me, and Linda Ruff too.
So, Freeman thought he was playing for me next week. So he's not here. We're going to sing it a cappella. Oh, beautiful. America, beautiful, please. And my dear friend Linda is joining me. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber wings of grain, for purple mountains, majesties above the fruited plain. America, God shed his grace on thee and crowned good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. See, we did it.
Please sit down. This is not what I was originally going to talk about. And it's a bit personal, but I need to say this. It wasn't long ago here in Seattle that Jews were excluded from a lot of things. There were gated communities where no Jews were allowed. I was the second Jewish member of the Seattle Yacht Club. My dad was the first. Glendale Country Club was founded because all other private golf clubs in town did not accept Jewish members. In 1996, I was the first Jewish president of this then 87-year-old Rotary Club of Seattle. Thankfully, those days of exclusion are largely behind us, and I've been fortunate to have been able to participate in the life of the greater Seattle community. I was also president of Temple de Hirsch Sinai. No, I wasn't the first Jewish president. That's the congregation where Rabbi Wiener and his predecessors have all been longtime members of this club. Last Sunday, with a good deal of effort and intention, some vandals broke into a secured area surrounding the park where the facade of the temple's original sanctuary still stands. They spray painted messages of hate. We are told that while Jews represent a little over 2% of the total population, we are targets of 55% of hate crimes. Success leads to complacency. We Jews were reminded that despite our successes of the last 70 years, there remain those intent on doing us harm. But this is not just a Jewish problem. Some of these people are Holocaust deniers, and some of the same people are conspiracy theorists about stolen elections or alien invasions, or that George Soros controls judges. There are linkages. The Anti-Defamation League and the Holocaust Center for Humanity are organizations that fight hate, not just against Jews, but against the 45% of hate crime victims that are not Jewish. Indeed, history tells us that complacency is a danger for all of us.
Skip, thank you for sharing that message. So important. We appreciate it. And thank you, Linda and Raymond. We appreciate you kicking off our meeting today. Okay, I want to also thank the Rotarians who stepped up to make our meeting a great experience today, including our meeting reporter, Pete Delane, online meeting host, Kim Moore, and greeters, Gina Hall and John Hojaboom. Now, today's meeting is jam-packed with great content. You'll meet one new member and hear a spotlight on a longtime member. You'll learn about the great work of our Rotary foundations, both internationally and locally. And then we'll hear from our Washington State Treasurer as our featured guest. But first, I'd like to welcome a few guests who have joined us here today. We have, along with our guest speaker, we have Adam Johnson, Communications and PR Coordinator. Adam, if you could stand, thanks. And Jesse Johnson with the Office of the State of Washington as well. Patrick Carter's daughter, Jasmine Bean, is with us. Jasmine. And a guest of Joel Paget is Brad Carnine. Brad, we're happy to have you here as well. Okay, I now welcome club member Joel Paget to the stage to introduce our newest Seattle Rotary member, and then he will be followed by club member John Steckler to share our member spotlight. Joel.
Thank you, Beth. It is my pleasure to introduce our newest member, Garin Wedeking, Classification Technology. And I think we have some pictures of him somewhere here coming in. There we go. He's peering out of the snow at Crystal Mountain. And then we have a second picture, which is when he's helping out with the Seattle We Heart. It's Seattle We Heart Seattle, which was coming up in the introduction, but that's the second picture. And Garin is sponsored by Steve Moore, who we thank. He met Steve while being an advisor to the Foster School of Business. And Garin is a senior consulate at Avedon, got to say that right, which is a joint venture between Accenture and Microsoft that began back in 2000. Its goal is to deliver innovative services and solutions to enterprises worldwide using Microsoft platforms. And Garin is involved in providing advice on how to accelerate business outcomes. But how did he get to this position? Garin grew up in Kirkland, where he was involved in civic groups and was co-chair of the Kirkland Youth Council. He's now lived in Seattle for over 20 years. His undergraduate degree was in comparative history of ideas, which I didn't even think existed when I was going to school, which is where he learned to be a critical thinker. And while earning his MBA at UW, he learned on what to think about. And now he puts both to work at Avedon. Prior to Avedon, Garin worked for 13 years in the food and beverage industry here in Seattle, and it's still a big part of his life and work. And this is where he met his wife, Laura Kirby, right? Laura Kirby. And after talking to Steve, he became apparent that to him that Seattle Rotary 4 would be where he could find ways to support the community and be bullish on Seattle, like the way Lisa Bridge recently spoke about Seattle at our club. Its goal is to deliver innovative, I've talked about that. Okay, he's already worked with We Heart Seattle, which you saw the picture, on cleanups and what he wants to do more. And Garin is excited about networking and relationship building opportunities with the members of Seattle Rotary 4. And Garin and his wife live in Wallingford neighborhood in North Seattle, along with their 2 boys. Please welcome Garin Classification Technology to the club. Welcome. We have another person coming on.
Thanks for having me. Hello, Rotarians, my fellow guests here today.
was playing around on Google and looking for a definition of hero the other day. And I found this. Let's see if I can do this. Not that. I didn't find that. There. I found the 10 traits of a successful hero. Hey, Jaime, how you doing? Didn't mean to do that. Sorry. Always wanted to do that. Here they are: courage, passion, integrity, honesty, confidence, patience, selflessness, caring, humility, and supportive. You notice there's no cape, boots, super hammer, superpowers, anything like that. But all of these traits are things that we individuals could inspire to. But they're also all traits that are reflective of our Spotlight Member of the Month, Patrick Carter. Classification, community, and human services. And I'm sure you'll agree that she is a hero as soon as you hear her story. Now, Patrick has survived many challenges in her life and should be applauded for using these challenges to help strengthen her as opposed to defining her. There we go. Okay, now Patrick was born in El Campo, Texas. Here she is, successfully graduating kindergarten. Patrick. Her mother, Darlene, was a teenage mother, and although not married to Patrick's father, Gerald, he did stay in touch with Patrick throughout her life. Patrick has 3 other siblings, 2 sisters, and a brother. Now, even though the siblings did not share a common father, they considered each other to be one family. Patrick's mother moved to California to start work at the VA hospital there. Patrick and her older sister and younger brother stayed in Texas to be raised by her grandparents. Her younger sister was later born in California. Now, in Texas, Patrick grew up with a front row seat to segregation. Blacks and whites were separated at schools, restaurants, bathrooms, theaters, everywhere. That was just the way it was. And Patrick felt a security with their Black friends and other Black families. But that security was soon to be upended. When Patrick was 12 years old, her mother sent for the 3 children to join her and their younger sister in California, as her job at the VA was going very well. Patrick grew up in a very different world, as the California lifestyle was far more segregated than she was used to in Texas. And at 14, Patrick was diagnosed with epilepsy, something she has learned to live with her entire life. Patrick attended Milpitas High School, a mostly white school with a sprinkling of Black students. And Patrick felt very vulnerable in this new environment. She felt exposed. And since she was living in a mostly white neighborhood, she saved up her money to buy a car just so she could go visit her Black friends. Although challenging, Patrick did survive. She never quit. And she graduated. In fact, Patrick was the first in her family, including her siblings, to graduate high school. And while in high school, Patrick had an internship with Bank of America, and she decided a career in banking might be the perfect fit for her. But as fate will have it, things don't always work out as we plan. Not long after high school, Patrick got pregnant and became a teenage mother herself. And the birth was difficult. After giving birth to her son, Zachary, Patrick fell into a coma for 5 days. Doctors were not sure if she was going to come out of it, but she did. Not long after, she came to Seattle to visit her mother, who now worked at the Seattle VA hospital. Patrick just fell in love with the area, and she decided to stay and raise her son here. She went to work at AT&T as a long-distance operator. Here she is. Look at that. The afro, black coffee in a styrofoam cup. And believe it or not, for those young people here in the room with those gorgeous dreads, and that's called a handset. Used to work with a telephone, That wasn't the job for her, so she went back to banking with a name from the past for many of us, Rainier Bank. And during this time, Patrick was challenged again with her son, Zachary got very sick. He was suffering from fluid on the brain. He stayed at Children's Hospital for over a month, and luckily, all went well. Today, Zachary is 44 years old and thriving here in Seattle. Patrick held it together during this period, and after a couple of other banking jobs, she was recruited by KeyBank to be the branch manager of the new branch in the Central District. Patrick thrived in her leadership position. She was a pioneer in creating the first in-store banking branch in a local Safeway. And in 1991, Patrick welcomed her second child, giving birth to a daughter named Jasmine. Jasmine is here today to celebrate the well-deserved recognition her mother is receiving. Thank you for being here today, Jasmine. Yeah. Her son, Zachary, has since given Patrick 2 grandchildren who she loves and adores. And But one thing, Patrick saw the difficult childhood many kids experience growing up in the Central District, and that brought the Boys and Girls Club to her attention. The Boys and Girls Club give children a chance for stability and growth. In fact, there are 4 pillars of focus for the Boys and Girls Club: character and leadership skills, sports, academics, career guidance. She became a board member of the Boys and Girls Club in the late 90s. The Rotary Club reached out to her and asked her to apply for the newly open executive director position. And you know what? She did. She applied for it, but she didn't get it. Fortunately, the position became open again after a short time later. And after much pleading by an executive at the Boys and Girls Club, she applied again. And in 2000, Patrick Carter became the executive director of the Boys and Girls Club. There she is. And in 2002, Patrick joined the Rotary Club of Seattle. For the last 20 years, she's been a very active member. She was a Seattle Rotary Board member twice. She served as a VP of membership. Currently, she's on the Classification and Program Committee. And just a few years ago, Patrick was promoted to the position of Area Director for Boys and Girls Club. And now she oversees 4 separate clubs. You know, just challenges in life seem a common occurrence for Patrick. In 2021, she suffered a heart attack that luckily has left her with no permanent damage. And when you see all these challenges that Patrick has faced, it's no surprise how much she values family. To her, time with family is her favorite pastime. To me, she is a hero in how she's approached all these challenges. For example, her epilepsy is something she controls and she refuses to let it control her. And after all she's been through, 2 things keep her going beyond her family. Self-care, very important. And number 2, Patrick, to her, every day is a blessing. I have to say, Patrick Carter, you are also a blessing. Fellow Rotarians, I give you our May 2023 Rotary Spotlight member, Patrick Carter, classification, Human and Community Services. There you go. Well deserved, Patrick.
Thank you, John, and congratulations, Patrick. We just so appreciate celebrating you. And Joel, thank you for the introduction of Garen, and we're really happy to have you join the club, Garen. Okay, we all strive to be servant leaders here at Rotary and help make our community and world a better place. Now, there are no better examples of servant leadership than Kathy Gibson, Jim Moore, and Nancy Osborne. Kathy has been a club member since 2000 and is a business mediator and avid outdoorswoman. She's served Rotary in many capacities over the years, including board member, Seattle Rotary Service Foundation president, Seattle Rotary Club president, and governor for District 5030. Now, Jim has been a Seattle 4 member since 1999, where he focused on international service projects with particular emphasis on malaria elimination in Africa. And Nancy is a 34-year Rotarian who served as a centennial president of Seattle 4. As part of our centennial, she founded, along with many other members of our club, Malaria Partners International. Kathy, I'll let you lead us off.
Thanks, President Beth. We all know about the good work of Rotary, from vaccinating children against polio, to providing relief to Ukrainian refugees, to funding scholarships for peace studies. These projects and so many more are possible because of Rotary member donations to the Rotary Foundation of Rotary International. We're going to get it. All right. The Rotary Foundation of Rotary International. Today, we're placing the spotlight on the Rotary Foundation, aka TRF, and why our support every year is vital. And here to tell you more is Jim Moore.
Thanks, Kathy. Just testing. Yeah. Seattle 4 members, we have a real responsibility to finance 2 related foundations that work together, our own Seattle Rotary Service Foundation and the Rotary Foundation that was introduced by Kathy. A little history about the Rotary Foundation. It was started as an endowment fund in 1917 11 years later, it got its current name. The Polio Plus Fund was added in 1985, and a couple of years later, the Peace Fellowships were added. 10 years ago, whoops, sorry about that. 10 years ago, the structure for our club-led global grants and district grants was created under the Future Vision program, and a program of scale grants were initiated. By supporting the Rotary Foundation, your gift makes our grant-supported service projects happen. Projects that eradicate polio, that promote peace, that treat and prevent disease, and build better communities here in Seattle and around the world. Moreover, when you donate to the Rotary Foundation, you're donating to a charity rated 4-star 100% nonprofit by Charity Navigator. Back. So let's see what happens to $100 that comes out of our club today that goes to the Rotary Foundation's annual fund. How does that come back to us? Well, in 3 years, that $100 gets put into $50, the World Fund Global Grant Matching Bucket, and $50 comes to our district, where it gets split into club-led district funds match and club-led global grant funds match. And why that's important is because, as an example, we have a project going on that our club led with a $10,000 ante in Zambia right now on malaria. And we received from the World Fund Global Grant Match $365,000 of matching funds. And from our district, $28,000 of matching funds. That's the power of our contribution to the Rotary Foundation. The last year, the foundation made grants totaling $260 million, led by Polio Plus at $150 million, and global grants at $73 million. There were about 1,200 of those. And the foundation would like to have every Rotarian every year contribute. You can be a sustaining member at $100 a year, or you can be a Paul Harris Society member at $1,000 a year, and a little bit more about Paul Harris in just a second. So we're looking for 100% participation from our club members. Currently, we're at 40. Make a donation today and bring us up toward that 100% number. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Well, here's Paul Harris, the Chicago attorney who started Rotary International with 3 business associates 118 years ago. And fun fact, today, April 19th, is Paul's birthday. We as Rotarians make our annual TRF contributions, and the Rotary Foundation keeps track. When a Rotarian's cumulative donation reaches $1,000, they are recognized as a Paul Harris Fellow, and they receive a Paul Harris Fellow pin. Today, we'd like to give a big shout out to the 172 Paul Harris Fellows in our club. Please raise your hand if you are a Paul Harris Fellow, including those of you on Zoom. Jim just said, wow, I couldn't agree more. 8 Seattle Rotarians are raising their hand for the first time today, having crossed over the $1,000 threshold of cumulative TRF donations in this Rotary year. If you're here today, will you please stand so we can thank you as you become a Paul Harris Fellow for the first time? And I see. And your pin and certificate are out at the table to be picked up. Well, the Rotary Foundation continues to track our annual contributions and to recognize Rotarian donors for each additional $1,000 they give. And we have 118 members who have received multiple Paul Harris Fellow recognitions. This year, 17 Seattle Rotarians advanced to that next level of Paul Harris recognition. A big thank you to these individuals who moved to the next level of Paul Harris donating to this year. And today, we'd like to recognize 3 members who achieved major donor status this year with cumulative contributions to the Rotary Foundation of over $10,000. And they are John Adams. John, will you stand up so we can thank you? Just home from India and Bhutan. Our past club president, Carl Legge, who couldn't be here today. So when you see him, please thank him. And our centennial year club president, Nancy Osborne. And Nancy is here to share why she contributes to the Rotary Foundation.
Thank you, Kathy. Isn't it great to be meeting here together? And for those of you on Zoom, come to an in-person meeting soon so you can experience the fellowship of Rotary. Well, we were all sequestered apart in our homes and only linked by Zoom. I'm happy to report that the Rotary Foundation was hard at work. A project I know well is the training of community health workers in sub-Saharan Africa. Malaria eradication began at our club 12 years ago with a single grant from our service foundation. But as Jim explained, that grant was matched and matched and matched and ended up making a huge financial and economic contribution to Africa. Malaria Partners International was joined by Rotary International, World Vision, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to form the very first Rotary International program of scale. The project to date has trained over 4,000 community health workers who in turn care for over 2 million members of their communities and villages. During the pandemic, testing and COVID treatment was added to their curriculum with a huge impact in reducing not only malaria, but COVID. Our community, oops, do I need to advance it? Well, okay, there we go. This is one of our community health workers, Bathsheba, and you can see her on the screen. These volunteers are changing the landscape of Africa with your financial support. This and so many other projects are only possible through the matching grants from the Rotary Foundation. To the 40% of the members of our club who have already contributed, your dollars are already hard at work. But to those who are yet to make their contribution, please donate by June 30th to ensure that we continue to be eligible for these matching grants. You can donate online, or one of our club members, David Robanek, can help you with it right here today. The details should be on your screen. Until I'm not used. Okay, the details are on your screen. And remember, they would be happy to take your credit card, your check, or even your firstborn. But seriously, David says no. Seriously, these donations are critically important. Very lives depend on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, Jim, and Nancy. We appreciate you inspiring us today. I'm excited that our donations can have such an impact for good. Now, I am pleased to introduce our featured speaker. Mike Pellicciotti was elected Washington's 24th state treasurer in 2020. As Washington's chief financial officer, Mike is dedicated to financial transparency, protecting Washington's financial health, and advancing policies that best serve our state's working families and retirees. Before becoming treasurer, he served 2 terms in the House of Representatives, where he served on the House fiscal committees, including the capital budget committees. And in the legislature, Mike fought for more equitable and open government, passing laws to get dark money out of politics and requiring that the legislature provide its public records. Mike has a degree in business administration and received his master's in rural development as a United States Fulbright Scholar, where he studied economic development. His Juris Doctor is from Gonzaga University, and he is a lifelong fan of Gonzaga basketball. Please welcome Washington State Treasurer Mike Pellicciotti.
Well, thank you. And thank you to Beth. It's such a pleasure to join all of you here today. I actually, over the last year, I've kind of made it a practice to come to as many Rotaries as I can. When I first ran for office, Beth was mentioning I served in the legislature. You know, when I first ran, I was running against a multi-term incumbent. So I had to knock on doors and talk to folks and learn what the issues were in the community. You know, John knows that. We talked a lot about the race back in 2016, but you know, I personally knocked on over 15,000 doors in that election. And I learned a lot about what was going on. That is a lot harder to do as a statewide elected official now in terms of knocking on doors. But I found that going to Rotaries has been a great way to kind of hear about and engage with members of the community all around the state. So this is actually, I think, my 24th Rotary in the last year. As I've kind of gone around the state, I've now visited all 39 counties, having substantive meetings over the last year, just to kind of hear about issues facing Washingtonians throughout our state. But you know, I guess I'm going to make a commitment now. I haven't made this commitment yet, but I'm going to find a way to make sure I go to every Rotary in the state. I've found this the opportunity to talk a little bit about the treasurer's office, because you know, whenever I bring up the fact I'm state treasurer, people are like, that's great, we have a state treasurer. I had no idea. That probably makes sense that we have a state treasurer. Kind of what does the state treasurer do? And they're like, it probably has something to do with money, which is very true. But it also, I always find it helpful, if it's all right, Beth, I'll talk a little bit about what the treasurer's office does, talk about some of the issues we're working on in the treasurer's office, and then open up to some questions that you have, which I always find to be one of the most kind of helpful and engaging parts of these talks. And so, treasurer's office has three kind of core functions. One is it handles investments for the state, or a good portion of the investments for the state, about $35 billion or so of state and local funds that I'm responsible for investing. I handle the debt management for the state. We have about $22 billion in debt that we manage here in the state. It always seems like a big amount of money, and it most certainly is, but I always put in the context that relates to bonds that have been issued. And I always kind of start by pausing and saying what a bond is, because we throw those terms around, but not everyone kind of appreciates that. So a bond is a fancy way of saying debt. It's essentially money that is loaned by the state of Washington, so we can get the money up front, and then we pay it back over the life of a particular project. So in the state of Washington, we actually balance our operating budget every year. That is a good thing. Not every state does that. But that is something we do here in the state of Washington, meaning that kind of operating expenses for the state. We have a current operating budget that's being considered of about $69 billion in the legislature. These are things that are balanced every year. We have two other budgets that are managed in the state of Washington as well, in addition to the operating budget. That is our transportation budget, which, as you might imagine, involves roads, bridges, things like that, and our capital budget, which are capital projects, right? Buildings, parks, things that are tangible. And those two budgets are funded through the issuance of bonds. So over the life of a project, over the life of a bridge, in the same way you might pay off your home as with a home mortgage over the life of that home, or a car loan over the life of that car, the state does the same in terms of issuing bonds for those kind of tangible projects, bridges, roads, things like that. And so my job as treasurer is not to determine what those projects are. That is up to your legislature and you and your advocacy to your legislators to kind of figure out what those projects are. Our job in the treasurer's office, though, is to kind of manage that debt and get the best rates that we can, kind of get the best financing that we can around those bonds and the debt that's issued. So that's kind of the second thing that we do. And it's a big part of the work that we do in the treasurer's office. And the third is I kind of serve as the state's banker. So we kind of have cash flow in the state of Washington, right? And kind of money in, money out. We have about $1/3 of $1 trillion a year in cash flow that we manage in the state of Washington. So those are kind of the three core functions of the work of the office, but we also serve on various other kind of about 9 different boards and commissions. They handle different financial policy for the state. So you might be familiar with the GET program, the 529 program, where you invest in your kids' or grandkids' education. I serve on that. Our state investment board, which manages about $180 billion now in terms of pensions. I serve on that. Serve on boards that manage kind of small business tax credits, the Housing Finance Commission, which handles kind of housing financing issues, and a range of other kind of boards and commissions. I also serve as the state's regulator of banks that accept public deposits, which is a fancy way of saying kind of the money that different school districts or city councils might have in the bank. Those banks have to be regulated, and that's one of the roles that I have for those institutions that handle those public deposits. That is one of the roles that I have as well. But, one of the things that, was important to me when I came in 2021 as state treasurer, when I was elected in 2021, was really, we're coming into the COVID economic recession. We had a $6 billion budget hole at the time. We had a range of challenges, as many of you recall. And one of the things that was important to me was not only obviously shoring up the finances for the state, but also making sure we were doing everything that we could to make sure that essentially the immediate concerns that we were seeing as a state were being well communicated. So one of the things that I did during that first year was kind of raise the alarm that I thought inflation would not be transitory, that we'd see inflation over a period of time, and that as a result of that, we would see federal interest rates rise to kind of stem the tide of that inflationary pressure we'd be seeing. And as you might imagine, as I was just talking about, the federal interest rates matter a lot to the work of the Treasurer's Office. Every aspect of the work of the Treasurer's Office is impacted by that. And that's why my main focus during that first year, in addition to being the first state that successfully received our federal funds to shore up some of our budget limitations that we had here in the state, I also made sure that we refinanced every bit of debt that we could legally refinance in the state of Washington. So there are some limitations on what debt we can and cannot refinance, but in the same way you can refinance your home loan when interest rates are low, we did that here in the state of Washington to lock in historically low interest rates. And in doing so, through the good work of the people in the Treasurer's Office, we saved the people of the state of Washington, just in the savings alone on what we were paying, over $385 million in money that was otherwise going to Wall Street and wasted interest payments, that is instead staying with the people of the state of Washington. Yeah. But what's exciting about the work in the Treasurer's Office is, number one, this is not just money, right? I don't need to tell anyone here who handles money. I've been hearing from Patrick in terms of her work earlier in banking. I mean, it's not just money in terms of what that is. It's tangible in terms of the difference between projects being able to happen, whether certain initiatives are able to be met by the legislature, whether they're able to meet the public needs without having to unnecessarily increase taxes on people of the state of Washington. So many of the important things that are taking place in the state of Washington are because of the good work in the Treasurer's Office. But it's not just that debt management. One of the things that was important to me is, as you might imagine, as interest rates rose, I also handle investments for the state, right? So we have our investments team that really focused on doing what's called kind of hugging that curve. And so we very effectively kind of hugged that interest rate curve. So as interest rates went up, a lot of different states and municipalities had been locked into interest rates over a longer period of time, thinking that interest rates were going to remain low. We were able to kind of hug that curve. And now, through the great work of the investment teams in our office, over the next 4-year outlook, we have over $1 billion going to the state of Washington just in investment returns on money sitting around that the state otherwise had sitting around. And that's what happens when you can kind of have that good management. Regardless of the market conditions, you're providing value to the people of the state of Washington in a way that, again, tangibly just makes things work, makes things stay on track, and allows for us to move forward in an effective way. One of the other things, when I came in as treasurer in 2021, I was coming out of the legislature and I went to our team, in the office, went to them and said, hey, what are some things we can do better here in the Treasurer's Office? And they said, well, actually, Mike, things are going pretty well. We have a good team. We seem to be on top of things pretty well. But, what you could really help with is the fact that we're always having to deal with laws that are outdated, or the legislature kind of mucks things up every now and again. Which I said, well, as a legislature, I certainly know quite well we're capable of mucking things up every now and again. But there's a lot of frustration by folks in our office that, bills would be passed that would impact the financial health of the state or the operations of the Treasurer's Office. And that was very frustrating. I said, well, we can actually do something about that while the laws are being written. As a statewide elected official, I can request legislation, have it introduced in the legislature. And so that was a big focus of mine in 2022, was actually during that short legislative session. We have a short legislative session, then we have a long legislative session. During that short legislative session, I started introducing legislation, things that I'm happy to go into if you have questions, but things deep into the weeds, just making things work a little bit better. Things get modernized. A lot of these bills have been written, during the early 80s or late 70s when interest rates were in a much different place. And so we just kind of updated things, and we actually passed as many bills that our office introduced that year and passed into law as our office had in the previous 5 years combined. And again, these are just things working, making things work, getting things on track. And so I felt, very good about that. And then one of the other aspects of working with the legislature that's been important to me was to really clearly communicate, my role as treasurer, right, is kind of serve as the banker, right? It's not my job to tell the legislature how to spend money or where to spend money more specifically. You don't want your banker giving you a call and saying, hey, we saw you bought this new car. Are you sure you need the newest version of the car? Or don't you want a used car instead? Right? That's not the job of your banker. But what I do also serve as is a kind of the chief financial officer for the state. And so I viewed my role in communicating to the legislature, certain financial guardrails that I thought they needed to operate within. Things that would be good for our financial health and make sure we're in a responsible position going forward so that we're not dealing with budget cuts in the future or things things that could be impactful to our financial health. And so I made 3 recommendations last year to our legislature in terms of those financial guardrails, how to manage funds here in the state of Washington. Number 1 was to make sure we work to fully funding our pensions. There is no more expensive debt than you can have than an unfunded pension liability. It's why I've pushed very significantly in making sure that we're doing everything we can to shore up and make sure our pensions are well funded. And as a result of that, and the good work of the legislature and a commitment over many years related to this issue, the legislature, or I should say the state of Washington now has, depending on how you calculate it, the number 1 or number 3 best funded pension now in the country. And like I said, that's something we can feel good about. That's good, not just because it's good and it feels good, and it's always good to be number 1, but it's impactful because, again, you can see a lot of states are in a real pickle related to how they handle their pensions. And again, there's no more expensive debt. Last year, we had a 22.5% return through our state investment board, right? I mean, look, to be clear, that is not going to continue, right? You just have to look at your 401k plans. We know where things are at. But again, over time, we've seen about an 8.5% return over the last 20 years in terms of the work of the state investment board. And again, that's money being lost if it's not well funded. And so it is important, not just in terms of the financial health of the state, but it's important for those who work so hard and deserve to make sure they have pension security related to that. That was our number 1 recommendation. The legislature met that recommendation. Second recommendation was that the legislature have a 5% debt service ratio. Well, that is a fancy number. Let me break that down a little bit for you. So I mentioned we have debt. Part of paying debt is paying off that debt service, the cost of the debt that you're paying. And as it specifically relates to our capital budget, that debt service not exceed 5% of the revenue coming into the state, right? So you have money coming to the state. You don't want more than 5% of that going to pay off your past stuff, your past projects. So while we have a significant amount of debt here in the state of Washington, I mentioned it was about $22 billion, that debt is manageable if that debt service ratio remains 5% or less. As you might imagine, that is always a tough sell to the legislature because they want to issue more debt. And there is no more bipartisan cooperation you can have in Olympia than issuing bonds. I can assure you of that. And it takes bipartisan vote. It actually takes 2/3 vote to actually pass and issue any new bonds. But the legislature followed that recommendation and kept that debt service ratio at under 5%. The third recommendation that we had was that our budget reserves, right, that kind of cash you have sitting around that's not being spent, be returned to our pre-pandemic levels, which was 10% of that kind of revenue that we have coming in. So again, you have revenue coming in. You want to make sure about 10% of the money you have is in reserves. At least 10% of the money you have is in reserves. That was by far the most challenging effort of the legislative session last year. Trying to convince the legislature in the last week and a half of the legislative session to pull back a couple $2 billion they'd earmarked for other projects, as you might imagine, can be a challenge. But the legislature followed that recommendation as well. And as a result of following those 3 recommendations, we had our credit rating reevaluated that summer right after the legislative session. And state has a credit rating in the same way you have a credit score. It determines how much you pay in your interest, right? If you buy a car, what's your interest rate? Whether you can have money even loaned to you at all, how much they're willing to loan to you. That you have that as a credit score. State has its own credit score. It's called a credit rating. Moody's is one of the preeminent credit rating agencies. And Moody's maintained our AAA credit rating for the state of Washington, which is the top credit rating you can have. And that feel free to give that a round of applause too. That is not. And again, these are things that we can feel good about. We can take pride in. It's always good to be number 1, all of that. But really what it means is just we're in good financial health. And so I always point out, for all of the challenges in the world today, and there are no shortages of challenges, your state finances are not one of them. And I hope that lets you sleep a little bit better at night. But you know, it's also important because, you know, I think about this and while the state of Washington, at least financially, is in a good place and a more responsible place than many other states. You know, not everyone is benefiting equally related to that. And that is why one of the things that has always been a focus of mine in the office is thinking long-term. Because, you know, you're lucky if a politician frankly thinks a year or two out, maybe to the next election if you're lucky. The culture that I try to instill in the treasurer's office is that everything we do has a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, 40-year horizon. Everything that we do. That's when you have good policies. That's when you actually are able to address issues. And that's when you're able to make sure that things pencil out with a long-term outlook. And so that's why I've introduced a proposal called the Washington Future Fund. It's this baby bonds model in which essentially money would be set aside in the name of every child who was born through an Apple Health funded birth. Apple Health is essentially kind of the Medicaid program for the state of Washington, identifies those born through lower income families. It represents 47% of the births in the state of Washington. 47% are born through Apple Health funded births in the state of Washington. In rural communities, it's more like 2 out of 3. And in several rural counties, it's more like 3 out of 4. And I don't need to tell anyone here in terms of the impacts that we have seen, obviously, in communities that have been denied access to capital for generations, often systematically, and how important it is to actually address foundationally that access to capital. Because all of the systems we have in place, I saw this through our boards and commissions that I serve on. The GET program, it is a great program if you're able to set aside a certain amount of money every month to be invested. The Washington Economic Development Finance Authority, that's a small business board that I'm on. It's a great program. It sets up small business grants. It knocks off certain interest rates for those of women and minority-owned businesses. Well, that's only so good if you can get access to that loan in the first place. If you actually have the seed money to do that. Housing Finance Commission. What's the first thing that comes up with folks who want to have a house? Well, that's great. I'm glad you want to be a first-time homeowner. Where's your down payment? Where's your capital? Unless you come from some degree, you know, when I talk to millennials today, what do they say? Well, yeah, I was able to get a house. Thank goodness grandma put that Boeing stock aside for me. Thank goodness I got help from dad, right? Whatever the case may be, right? Well, that is not sustainable and that is not going to work long-term. And so the idea of the Washington Future Fund is saying, hey, we're just saying a portion of the investment earnings coming into the state of Washington, literally money sitting around, investment earnings on that, a portion of that be set aside and invested in a similar way to how we invest our pensions for the next couple of decades, so that the child who's born today knows that by age 20, 30, up until age 35, would have tens of thousands of dollars now waiting for them to be used in one of 3 wealth generating tools. It can be used either as educational pursuits, including the trades and apprenticeships, so that those who want to do pre-apprenticeship programs no longer denied access to that because they can't afford the licensing costs and other needs related to that, or the pre-apprenticeship program that otherwise would serve those needs. It's also making sure that those who are being set up for, who want to start a small business have a down payment or have seed money in order to start that. Or foundationally, those who want to own property can use that money toward a down payment. So we can finally interrupt the generational cycles of being denied access to property. There's a lot of talk about building new houses, which is great. I mean, there's talk about building almost 900 new houses over the next 20 years. Well, there are 1 of 2 directions that's going to go. Those are going to either be built, and those who have capital are going to be able to access that, right? And that often could be institutional investors or corporate ownership, and then have that leased and rented to the same folks who are being denied access to property now. Or we can make sure we're being responsible in a way and thinking long-term and making sure that that down payment is there to meet those needs in a way we couldn't otherwise afford to do it without thinking long-term. So that, that is one example. Next week, Jesse Johnson from our office is here. He's been helping lead both the Washington Future Fund, but also helping lead our efforts related to next week, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, who is former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, who now is, I think, Undersecretary in the Department of Labor, is coming out here to join me in talking about retirement security, because that's the other issue we have to get out ahead of. We talk about the gig economy, folks who don't have pensions. I mean, I was talking about the great work we're doing for pensioners. Well, that's true. That's only so good as folks have access to pensions. We need to be thinking about those issues long-term. That's how we're going to fix these issues. That's how we're going to move forward. It's with that long-term view, and we can do it in a responsible way. So I'm going to end there because I do want to make sure we have a few minutes for questions. And I just want to, as always, just very much appreciate the opportunity to join Rotaries.
You know what? I'll go first. I've got 3 quick questions. Who's your boss?
The people of the state of Washington. I'm directly elected statewide by the people of the state of Washington. So you and everyone here and the other 24 Rotaries I've been to and everyone else obviously around the state.
Oh man, I want to be elected. I don't want a boss. What do you hate?
I got like 7 million bosses. So
All
it
right.
depends on how you look at it.
All right. What do you hate about your job?
What do I hate about my job? I was just mentioning, Skip and I were talking about this. He's like, what do you like about the job? Which I think is a kind of better lead question on it. And
Everybody asks that question. I want to know what you don't like about it.
I have the best job in state government. I truly believe that. I have the best job in state government. I love this job. Love this job. I love what we're able to do. I love how when we do things right in a responsible way, how impactful it is. I love how when we're thoughtful about things, we can move the needle just a little bit and truly move things in a major impactful way. So there's nothing I really hate about the job. I don't know, Jesse, is there anything I'm usually complaining about? I don't know. I have a great team in the office. One of the things I will say, oh, well, certain legislators at certain times, I guess, maybe, no, but if they're blocking certain legislation, maybe, but that's temporary. I promise that's temporary. But what I will say is this, and this is something I always mention in speech, and I can't believe I haven't mentioned it yet, is I always have one ask in every speech that I give. We're doing all this work in the treasurer's office with like 65 folks, about 65 people in the treasurer's office. It's one of the smaller agencies, but these are very talented people who have been in this office 10, 20, 30 years, some are closing in on 50 years of service in the state treasurer's office. They can be doing a lot. They could be making 2, 3, 4 times as much in the private sector. That is a fact. But they do this public service. So when I talk about the extra $1 billion coming to people's state of Washington, the extra 385 through good debt management, so that money comes back to you. So my only ask is that if you bump into somebody from the state treasurer's office, that you thank them for their service, because that is really why we're able to do all the work we're able to do. So, yeah.
Thank you for coming and being with us today. There used to be a thing called a state chartered bank. And I was just wondering, as you were being introduced, whether or not in Washington State, we still have those elements.
So there is the ability to have certain banks that are state chartered. It's actually been impactful on issues of cannabis banking, which I'm happy to talk about. One of the things I did at the end of the last legislative session, the first thing I did is actually went to DC to address the fact that in the state of nationally, cannabis retailers, a $1.4 billion a year industry here in the state of Washington, have to operate mostly in cash. That is nuts. The old saying like, hey, why do you rob a bank? That's where the cash is. The cash isn't in banks anymore, right? The cash is in the pot shops, right? And we saw that a robbery a day was taking place in the state of Washington. It's why I went to DC. It's why I've met with those who have been leading legislation there. I met with every member of our delegation, why I've been working very closely with Senator Murray on this issue. And not just working with them, but also working with other state treasurers around the country. So let me give you an example. State Treasurer of Alabama. His name is Young Boozer. That is actually his name. Young Boozer's Treasurer of Alabama. Might be Young Boozer the fourth, actually, who ironically has been very much helping me on cannabis banking issues. But Young, I went to Young. I said, look, you're getting legal cannabis for medicinal purposes in a year. Let me tell you what's coming your way. And he has been a great partner and got Richard Shelby, Senator Shelby, who had been very much opposed to this issue, to get neutral. Senator Tuberville, he got to publicly support this. The new replacement for Senator Shelby is now publicly supporting. We now have 60 votes in the Senate, which is what we need to pass this. So it is a major focus of mine moving forward related to this. So I know your question was related to kind of state chartered banks. What got me thinking about one of the other issues we're working on is making sure we're finding ways to do that. So the answer to your question is yes. But it's mostly impactful on issues it's significantly impactful on issues of cannabis banking.
All right, we got a question from the Zoom. Can you talk about the impact of potential U.S. debt default will have on Washington State and what your office is doing to prepare?
Well, that's a great question. So like some of you, I was watching the speaker election very closely, and it was about halfway through the first vote that I picked up the phone and called my deputy for investments. And I said, I don't like where this is going. It is clear that the new majority party in Congress is going to be controlled by a couple members, and that is going to cause major issues related to the debt ceiling and whether or not that is reissued. When I talk about how impactful issues of interest rates are, that is important. I think about that a lot. Not honoring the debt ceiling commitment by the United States government would be incredibly impactful, dangerously impactful. not only to our reputation. I mentioned last time their inability to deal with this several years ago actually led to a credit downgrade for the United States government. It is a major concern. Now, I say all that, which I also think we do have major issues related to debt issuance by the federal government. Obviously, they print money. We balance our budgets. They're able to print money. That is a difference, and it is something that needs to be addressed. But it doesn't need to be addressed as a part of whether the federal government pays its bills or not. And I feel very strongly, I have teamed up with other state treasurers nationally in terms of communicating the importance of this. And I hope that that's something you are communicating to all of your elected officials in DC on how important it is to be responsible on this. But I do have concerns, especially on the House of Representatives sides, US House of Representatives sides, because I do think that there are those who want more of a show than they really care about governing. And this is a foundational aspect of governing, being responsible and paying your bills.
Question here.
One last question. Okay.
Yeah, Mike, thanks for the work that you do. Can you comment on how we fund schools in the state of Washington? It seems like we're going through boom and bust cycles right now. Districts are cutting. And it also seems like wealthier districts have an easy time raising money through bonds and levies. Could you comment, please?
Thank you, Mark. I think, so when I came to the legislature, when I was elected in 2016, one of the things that was actually important to me was finally funding McCleary. And there were two reasons for that. One is we needed to do it. We legally had to do it. And two, it's a foundational aspect actually related to our credit and making sure that we're paying our bills as well and our legal obligations. Obviously, the legislature did that. That did not include, as you know, special education funding, which has now become one of the biggest challenges this budget cycle. We have had conversations with legislators in terms of the importance of addressing that, even if it's not included technically as a part of the McCleary obligation, that take place. And I think the heart of your question is spot on, which is foundationally, those who are able to fund their educational needs locally are the more wealthy communities. And a lot of systems that have been set up allow for that perpetuation and continuation of those issues. I don't know if that's not going to be fixed in the next couple of years by the legislature. I think that we're going to continue to see those inequities. What I can do as state treasurer is really promote the Washington Future Fund, which to me is foundational of offsetting those inequities that are taking place so that we know that access to capital is there, so that 13 or 14-year-old going into high school who might now be in a community where they're looking to their friends and say, I don't have money, you don't have money, your parents don't have money, I don't have access to capital. What does my future really look like? Well, I think that 13 or 14-year-old would have a much different view if they knew that there were real funds available for them to achieve whatever their God-given potential is. That pre-apprenticeship program actually is accessible to them. That owning property is not just a pipe dream. And that to me is the steps we can take in the treasurer's office to offset some of those inherent inequities that I think you're spot on in highlighting. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mike. We're grateful for the time that you have taken to join us here at Seattle Rotary, and in recognition of the generosity of your time, we have made a contribution to Harvest Against Hunger in your name. So we appreciate the 600 servings of healthy produce that we've donated. Thank you, Jan and Ken, for fielding questions from our members. I want to encourage everyone to visit seattlerotary.org for a list of the upcoming events and activities for our members. We have lots of things ahead for us, from discounted tickets to see Sweeney Todd at the Fifth Avenue Theater, to visiting the Duwamish Longhouse, as I mentioned, to a private tour of Theo's Chocolate Factory. Obviously, that's a highlight. There are many ways to get out in your community and engage with fellow members. Now, these opportunities are just one of the many benefits of being a member of Seattle Rotary. And I did want to mention one other service opportunity where we can all make a real difference in our community. Saturday, May 20 is the Mayor's Office One Seattle Day of Service. You may recall this took place last year, and they had over 4,000 volunteers who signed up to help clean up our city. We are excited about this opportunity to get ready for the MLB All-Star, and where we'll be welcoming hundreds of thousands of visitors. So we'll be sending out details via email about that opportunity, and it'll include a registration link so you can sign up. Now, as I do every week, I leave you with a few highlights from your Seattle sports team. Last Saturday, the OL Reign came away with a win at their home opener in front of another record-breaking crowd at Lumen Field. Seattle Sounders didn't have as good of a day, however, as they lost a heartbreaking match against our rivals Portland Timbers, and on Portland's home turf, no less. Now, the Mariners first swept the Rockies and then dropped the last 2 games against the Milwaukee Brewers. We hope that they are doing better. Bill, are you checking the score? 0-0. All right, thank you. We're still in it. Meanwhile, the XFL Seattle Sea Dragons kept their postseason dream alive when they beat the St. Louis Battlehawks in a blowout game last weekend. In only their second year, though, the Seattle Kraken made their playoff debut on the road and beat the defending Stanley Cup champion Colorado Avalanche. And Bill tells me that this is the first time that an expansion team has done this. Is that correct? Yeah, that's really tremendous. Now, game 2 is tomorrow night, again in Colorado. And then on Friday night, our city will light up in blue to welcome the team home to play their first playoff home game on Saturday at Climate Pledge Arena. So I wanted to mention 2 other quick things. First, thanks to Live Oak, they reminded me that our Seattle Thunderbirds are also in the playoffs, so that's exciting. And Bill was sharing that the Cal Duel, which is a rowing event, crew event that is older than our club. It started in 1903, and that'll take place on Mountain Lake Cut on Saturday. So I will leave you with this quote from the controversial and highly successful basketball coach, Bobby Knight. He said, "The key is not the will to win. Everybody has that. It's the will to prepare to win." That's important. This meeting is adjourned.